Okay, good morning, everyone. It's really nice to know that so many of you have tuned in this morning. My name's Anna, and I'm a senior therapist for the Witherslack group. I'm also a psychological therapist for children, young people, and families. So that's me. Well, obviously, we're not in an interactive session today, but I hopefully will be hearing from you towards the end with some of your questions and views and thoughts. And there'll be a couple of opportunities where I just might invite you to post in the Q&A this morning so that Jodie can gather in some thoughts and ideas. But yeah, lovely to be with you this morning. And I really hope the next 30 minutes is going to give you some tools and some strategies that are really going to benefit you for what you need right now and into the future. So we're going to be doing a few things over the next 30 minutes, which I'm going to invite you to join me with. So we're going to relax, first of all, very brief sort of little relaxation, little sort of check-in as we start this morning's session. We're then going to review, we're going to have a little look at the SENCO role, what it's all about, recent research into SENCO wellbeing, and what could support you in the role based on recent studies and surveys that have been done. And we're going to reflect on some specific workplace strategies and approaches to supporting you in role. And then we're going to look at recharging, really important. So what specific tips, tools, techniques might help you both professionally and of course personally along the way. Okay, so just for the first literally sort of 90 seconds, 2 minutes, I'm going to invite you to join a small noting exercise. We are just going to take ourselves from the start of our morning this morning when we woke up, and we'll just walk through our morning to the point that we arrived here in this webinar. Okay, the technique we're going to use is called a noting technique, and the noting technique very simply is like brushing each thought and feeling with a feather. That's what you're doing. Some of you might have come across this technique before. You might be using it with your children and young people that you work with, but we're using a very light touch, almost like a feather sort of touch, to walk through our morning in our mind, just what happened. So from when you woke up this morning, your morning routine, perhaps brushing the teeth. So we're not looking to step back into thoughts and feelings. We're just looking to literally note the morning as it happened. That's our first option. Our second option is you could just pop down on a post-it note some of the reasons why you've sort of joined in with the webinar today, what you're hoping to get from it. Okay, so that's option 2. If you're with me for option 1, let's just start that brief, as I say, minute and a half, walking through our morning. So taking a couple of nice deep breaths, if that feels helpful. And just starting with the moment you woke up this morning, just walking through in your mind, what happened, what was the routine, getting yourself ready for your day. Just noting those things as if you're touching each one with a feather from leaving your house, journey to work, maybe arriving to work, maybe arriving in your team, maybe starting your tasks for the day. And then maybe bringing yourself to this forum, to this webinar this morning. Okay, so we're here and we are ready. We're going to join back together, whether you've been doing a little bit of that noting technique with me or whether you've been jotting down a few thoughts on a post-it. Coming back together now, we're going to move into just reviewing for a few minutes what impacts wellbeing in the SENCO role. What does reports, research, what are the findings over recent years? So obviously, because we're not interactive this morning, I can't ask you all these things about your role. But there is quite a lot of research, really interesting research into what is impacting SENCOs, what is impacting you in the sector, in your roles day to day. So most studies across research literature are noting occupational stress inevitably. You guys know this. There is occupational stress in the role. It's a very full role. There are lots of responsibilities, lots of things going on in role. So from moderate to more severe occupational stress was experienced by the majority of SENCO, up to 84%. Some repeat studies across the last few years, pre-COVID and then post-COVID, noticed increasing impact actually on professional well-being over time. So noting reasons for that, particularly reduced resources and funding and the impacts of COVID itself, which we know. Okay, I'm not telling you guys anything that you don't know. You know all these things. Some of the factors, okay, that were looked at were excessive workload, the lack of resource or shrinking resource, reduced funding, the status of the role, relational and emotional factors, and complex systems, which the role definitely sits within a set of really kind of complex matrix kind of working going on in this role. It's a complex one. And then there was legislative and structural changes in some of the research that were identified around the role. It's still quite a recent role. So I was really struck by how recent some of the SEN legislation is from the government and Department for Education. It was only in 1994. I'm sure a lot of you know this, but I didn't know this. I found this really interesting that the SEN Code of Practice came in 1994. And it wasn't until 2003, I think, that it was made mandatory in schools. Sorry, 2008, it was made as a mandatory obligation that schools have a SENCO. And then more recently, from 2014, the recommendation that SENCOs sit within the school leadership team. That's still just a recommendation as I understand it. So also, the research identified some of the frustrations of multi-agency working, okay, working in really complex systems and working with other agencies, organisations that are under a lot of pressure, that are not adequately resourced as well. And that's very much the picture, obviously, of where the SENCO role sits. And the feeling identified in a lot of the surveys and research about SENCOs feeling really in the middle. So really quite sort of positioned in this triangle, I suppose, between the school system, the state and probably sort of local authority, and families and children and young people. So feeling really in this kind of middle with all that brings with it. Research also sort of looked at specific motivations in role and well-being. So in one study, 90% of respondents said the role impacted quite significantly or negatively on their mental health, and 55% reported that on their physical health. But the majority of people surveyed still reported job satisfaction and high levels of commitment and motivation to making a difference. And this is huge. This came across so strongly in all the surveys that I was reviewing. So the feeling and role of being a champion for inclusion, for championing difference in schools and building this more inclusive experience for children and young people with special educational needs. Some of the measures which then were identified in the research as potentially helpful to SENCOs that were reported to reduce occupational stress. So some of those were working with an educational psychologist, an EP, the culture in schools. We'll talk a little bit more about culture in a moment. The systems themselves as well, of course, really important. Then the allocation of time, the consistent allocation of time for the role of the SENCO. There was huge variation in that across the surveys that I looked at. So all surveys found a lot of variation between some SENCOs working with 8 to 12 pupils in a full-time role, and in other settings, you might be working with a provision for 30 or 35 or more pupils with the same sort of time allocation. So there was huge variability. Again, all things that I'm sure you guys are very aware of. That there was quite a lot as well around the access to high quality networking opportunities. Status came up across as well, the surveys and the literature. So looking at the need for inclusion on a senior management or leadership team. And then needs assessed training came up as well. Very, very important. And the importance of streamlining of processes as well came up. So for a moment, I'm just going to invite you just to have a little bit of a think, bearing all that in mind. That's a lot, okay? And again, not anything that you guys probably don't know or are not aware of. You know what you're all working with, but specifically you in your role. Just think for a moment about all the different things that your role involves, okay? And so if any of these are sort of looking familiar to you, so these are all things that SENCOs do just as part of role, and they're huge. I mean, very, very specialist knowledge and skills which you're applying to children's learning experience. You're influencing decision making internally and externally. You're influencing others' professional practice. That's huge and very sometimes really challenging. So important, but a huge area of your work. You're an advocate. You're advocating for children and young people. You're navigating complex systems, sometimes failing systems. Yeah, some of our public health or care systems are under extraordinary pressure and are underinvested. We know that, don't we? So some of you are involved in system or process change. I mean, I think the role as a whole, because it's relatively new in education terms, if we look at the whole span of education, I think you are all system changes, actually. When we think about it over the long view, it's a huge amount of change that's gone on around SEN work and our understanding and approach over even recent years. You're linking systems, teams, organisations. Often you're stabilising or you're mitigating traumatic impact for children. That's really important. We'll come back a little bit more in the area of trauma in a minute, but that's huge as well and really relates to well-being, which is why we'll come back to that one. And you're doing, I'm sure, complex safeguarding work, and you're always trying to keep child-centred outcomes. That's huge, right? It's the reason that we're all here. So really, really important. And linked to all of that, in your work, you're providing emotional containment, psychological containment, and co-regulation, which again is huge. It's a huge amount of work. It's emotional work, and it's a massive part, I think, of the job. So we're gonna just pause for a moment there. And again, I'm just going to invite you to reflect for a moment on 3 things that impact workplace resilience for you in your role. So what's going on currently? And it changes over time, and it might change, week to week as well. But for your well-being, for your workplace resilience in particular, and just for how you experience your role at the moment, what's going on for you? Just have a little think. You're very welcome to post things in the Q&A box at this point. Jodie will be collating all this sort of feedback and ideas and thoughts and reflections, which is incredibly sort of useful to know what your experience is. Some of these things might be coming up for you. These are just sort of ideas of what you might be thinking about. You might be in changing environments, changing teams, changing leadership, changing management, all sorts of change, which can be unsettling, can be difficult. It might be around resource workload. There might be other health things going on, which always, they're always can impact us obviously things that we're coping with physically as well, environmental, the environment you work in, is it conducive to feeling regulated, feeling, that you can do your job effectively? What's that like for you? There's always the personal layers, that we don't just leave ourselves at the door when we come into work. We are ourselves as well. So there's lots of layers. There's all the work relationships that you hold. There's obviously personal relationships, then there's work relationships. There's the relationships with the children, the young people, that we're hugely committed to, we're hugely invested in, and then their wider relationships with family, parents, carers, and there might be something around working with children and young people who've experienced a lot of trauma in their life. So I think that's one area that is layering with our work in special educational needs, is the aspect of trauma, which we know that young people with special educational needs are more vulnerable to experiencing. So just for a moment, just staying with that theme a little bit. So for children and young people with a special educational need, so by young people who are autistic or have other diagnoses, have other presentations and things going on for them, we can also understand how they're presenting, what's going on for them, sometimes in terms of a trauma history, and sometimes quite a complex trauma history. I'm sure many of you, this is very much the area that I work in, quite trauma-based psychotherapist for children and young people. So I'm sure some of this is relevant. You might be working in the area with some of your young people, which is the area of more complex trauma, which we're thinking about as early trauma, when it's sort of environmental, it's developmental, it's over time, transgenerational, so that kind of area of complexity, or children, young people and families who've experienced a succession of traumas, multiple traumas over time, and that's also quite complex. So these might be areas of your work which you very much feel layer with the work that you're doing. And just a reminder around the window of tolerance. I don't know about in your work, but if you've come across this, you probably have. And in my work, I do find it hugely helpful sometimes just to come back to as a model, Dan Siegel's model, who's a US-based trauma researcher and clinician, and the window of tolerance, just thinking about what that means in our work and in your work. So the children and young people that we work with might have a much smaller window of tolerance. That could be due to complex trauma. It could be due to their special educational need. And we're always working, aren't we, to kind of increase their window of tolerance over time. And it's a long-term sort of goal. We're trying to do that through the whole experience of learning as well that they have with us. But being very aware of where our young people are at on any given day with their hyperarousal, their hyperarousal, but pressures on the window of tolerance, I think, is kind of what we're thinking about. We're just sort of holding in mind. Going back a little bit to culture, culture is something that we can all try and influence and try and model and try and bring to the places that we work, an idea of the culture that we want to be part of and that we want to work in. But it's a bigger project, and it is obviously quite leadership and management based as well. Has to be the whole, and it has to be quite strong, doesn't it, at a leadership level? But these were some ideas. I don't know, you might want to think what the culture kind of feels like, what it's like in your setting, and how that supports you and your well-being, because I think it really can. I think it really should. I was thinking about cultures that are relational, at their core. So they're about people and believe that people and their contribution matter the most. A culture that's trauma-informed. I think in this kind of work, we do need to draw on quite sort of readily, don't we, the and have in our minds the sort of neuroscientific and developmental models that we can draw on sort of day to day and work with, and that's across the whole culture, the whole team, the whole setting. A culture that's curious is such a helpful. I mean, it's PACE, isn't it? It's the PACE principles. Curiosity, I think, is a brilliant one. I think it's staying out of judgment, just not assuming and maintaining that open mind. Acceptance of difference. Again, it has to be really at the core, doesn't it, of the culture that you work in order to bring what you bring, and to maintain that sense of kind of well-being really in your job. Challenge and change, accepting of all of those things. Empathic, standing in each other's shoes. Are you in a culture that can do that for each other, and how important is that to you as in the role that you do? An agile approach, a culture that's agile, that can sort of switch things up, do things differently, and try and do things better when when it can. Is that the culture you're in? Or does it feel a bit, sometimes it can feel a bit stuck, can't it? A bit difficult to get things to move and shift. Effective communication. So communication that's not too much, it's not loading, it's appropriate to needs. That could, and positive, like positive communication can go a long way to support in workplace well-being. Staying child-centered and not system-focused. I mean, these are all things that we would want, aren't they, in the culture that we work in? And a culture that provides containment for its staff, for its employees. We work with a lot of complexity and a lot of difficulty and a lot of challenge. So the culture and the ethos that we work in needs to be containing, doesn't it? And to co-regulate with us. Otherwise, it becomes really tricky, doesn't it? Staying with that theme of co-regulation, this is just a really helpful image, I think, again, just to kind of carry in our minds, isn't it? Just the amount of co-regulation work that I think you're all doing day to day. So the need to first and foremost co-regulate with a child in order to help them to learn. Regulation work, then relationship work, relating to you, to the environment, to the task, and to the learning. And then you get that higher level reflection, that higher level cognition work that's going on. And that's the space then where the child can learn. But the co-regulation is what is so fundamental, I think, to the roles that you're doing, and why it's potentially draining, on emotions and emotional resource, for the professional. So moving that forward, what supports the supporter? What supports you guys? And again, these are just, you've got lots of ideas yourselves about this. Please do post them again in the Q&A box as we go through. What are the tools or the processes or the things that have been put in place in your workplace that really support you as the supporter? These are just ideas again, but effective and supportive management and leadership, a team that's well-resourced, an appreciative and empathic culture, so that culture that we're talking about, high quality and appropriate CPD for the level of challenge for what's required of you in your role. And then reflective practice. Reflective practice is one that I want to focus on a little bit next. To give you an idea of two approaches, you may be using one or both of these already, which is like amazing if you are, but I want to just dive into two approaches, if we can, for a moment, that I think support. This was backed up by some of that research literature as well that we looked at earlier. Why and how these two approaches might make a difference, in your professional role. The first one is clinical support. So clinical support with who, what is it, why does it help, and how do we go about this? So clinical support could be literally with any clinician that is available to you and can provide a reflective practice space, essentially. It's very work focused, but it's very helpful to look at, connected to work, what are the social and emotional impacts of the work on the worker, on the professional. And that's the sort of territory we're in, which is why it's really helpful if you have access to an EP, educational psychologist, psychotherapist, or another clinician who can provide that. It can be done for an hour to an hour and a half each month, each term. And it is really focused again on work-based examples with children and young people. What is it in the work that is deeply challenging? There's always something that our work brings to us that presents a significant challenge. And we're thinking more in the emotional and psychological sense as well. This is not the same as having therapy. This is not the same thing. This is clinical support, but it goes to the heart of all these other things that we've been talking about with trauma-informed working, co-regulation work, and can be really supportive over time. Can be done one-to-one, or it can be done as a team. Yeah, it doesn't have to be one-to-one. It can be really lovely to do it on your team with the support of a clinician. It helps because it helps you empty the bucket. So that image of like, oh, our buckets get full, we need to empty them. And work-wise, with the complexity of work that you're doing and the emotional complexity of it, you need to be able to do that, I think. And it can really reduce work-related stress. It offers co-regulation, which is why it's lovely to do it in a team, actually. And it might offer clinically informed approaches for your children and young people that you're working with, many of whom might experience really high anxiety. It might be really nice to work alongside in this way a clinician and really look at some of the approaches to anxiety and just have a look at those and what's helping, what's not helping as a team. That can be really helpful. And organising it really is, I think, requesting it. I've worked in a trauma recovery school before during the COVID pandemic, and this was requested quite early on, actually, during the pandemic by the practitioners, and the head teacher just organised it through the local EP who, just made themselves available for one-to-one clinical support through the pandemic period. And I think it was really helpful for people because there was obviously a lot of layers during that period, but there still are. The second approach to think about would be a peer reflective practice group. So this could be just internal, but maybe across teams. So it might include members of education team, pastoral, might include a member of your clinical team, your school counsellor, and your members of your team, your SEN team. It's handy to have a facilitator for one or two or several of you to facilitate who's got a little bit of experience of facilitating reflective practice sessions, which are always trying to open things up to thinking, to new thinking. So they're not facilitating a reflective practice group is not always about jumping to solutions focused practice or problem solving. Sometimes it is that, or sometimes that's the outcome, and that's great. But it's also about opening up the maximum amount of space in the room for the group that's present with all their thoughts, feelings, and skills to contribute the maximum amount. And that's it's just good to start off with someone who's quite used to doing that, and that's in their comfort zone. And then it's great if other people can rotate that facilitation. You might want to start with a group contract as well. It's really helpful. Just what do we want from the group? Confidentiality, safety, and all those good things. So again, you might want to schedule it each term, bringing areas of your work as well which present you with particular challenge. That would be my recommendation. Take things to these reflective practice groups that are challenging. Okay, it's what clinicians do in our supervision. We take the work that is most challenging or feels most stuck or feels most difficult. That's really helpful. Again, it empties out the bucket. It brings you multidisciplinary skills and approaches back into your practice. It's knowledge share, it's mutual support, and it's co-regulation. And these groups can be really powerful over time. They can really kind of grow really in their usefulness within your setting. And again, 2 to 3 people from different teams might share and organise that facilitation. Okay. We're moving on a little bit now, just for the last 5 minutes. I just want to think with you about tips and tools for well-being. So how do you recharge? What does that look like for you? What's important for you? So emptying out your bucket, we talked about that. The bucket gets full and we need to empty it out. Okay. We use this metaphor, don't we, quite a lot with the kids that we work with. I know I do. So physically, I mean, we know this stuff. You guys all know this stuff. I know this stuff. It's like we try, don't we, to do all the right things for ourselves, for our bodies, for our minds. But yeah, we have a lot going on, but we know about the benefits sometimes of physical exercise, moderate exercise, and more intense exercise. It doesn't need to be so much, but we know about that. We know about emotionally and psychologically what helps us co-regulating time, social time with family and friends. That can get really shut down, can't it, when we're under pressure? Sometimes we just want to take ourselves away, not socialize so much. But making time for that where it feels helpful, we know that that's a good support strategy as well. Getting the right work support, and again, this reflective practice time can be important. So as well as emptying out our bucket, we want to refill. We want to refill our cup with things that we really enjoy, that are meaningful to us, things that we can take notice of. These are sort of some of the 5 pillars. I think this is in particular the Mind charity sort of 5 pillars of well-being and workplace well-being. All of you are giving a lot already. Many of you are probably learning as well a lot all the time. So they're just some ideas, very, very general. I put here a few of the kind of ideas for body and mind. Again, all things that we sort of know these things, don't we, that they're really useful to us. So we do sometimes look at our food and nutrition and how that might be helping or not helping towards stress. Things like, sugar levels, kind of sugar can be quite a dysregulating one for our central nervous system. It's quite a difficult one. Caffeine, it can affect some of us more than others, doesn't always affect some people in terms of sort of dysregulation or the central nervous system. But these are all areas that we can look at, can't we? We can tweak. Exercise, sleep, inflammation in the body is a result of stress. We know that from a lot of research. That might be something that if you're experiencing higher stress levels and over time and you're noticing more inflammation, that's something to check in with your GP about. And there may be some quite simple sort of dietary factors to that as well as sleep, as well as exercise. There are other treatments, things like cold water treatment, which is a bit extreme, but there are ways with stress and inflammation, which can become a bit of a vicious cycle. Things like deep pressure, bilateral stimulation, which is as simple as walking, but there's others as well. Jogging and reading as well as bilateral stimulation. So all of these calming things, many of which we think about, right, for our children and our young people, but do we really think about them for ourselves? Do we sort of deep dive into those things and think what's going on in our bodies? For our minds, there's a few sort of suggestions there around journaling and sort of kind mind workbooks that you can get, which are quite lovely. That social and family time again. Enjoyable learning something that you're just really enjoying. There are short courses online now for when you're noticing higher stress levels or maybe tipping into anxiety sort of type symptoms. Always get advice and guidance on anxiety symptoms from your doctor. But short courses of CBT, they can be online as well. It can be really some really helpful techniques. I wanted to put this out there though as a kind of guidance on not trying to do everything. Just this book, if you've ever come across it or read it, Atomic Habits, is about establishing micro habits. It's not about trying to change everything all of the time constantly. It's about changing tiny little things in your daily routine that over time really add up. There's a lot of evidence around this. It's just an interesting book if you fancy reading it or just picking up some of the highlights of it. Yeah, changing very small things and noticing that change over time. So a couple of sensory approaches just to put out there that maybe you haven't come across, maybe you have, but there's quite a lot of apps now and specialist audio, which really links into central nervous system calming. And this happens through polyvagal nerve stimulation. But there are apps. I put Calm on there as one of them that you may have come across. It's a paid for app, but it can also be offered free sometimes with things like mobile phone accounts and bank accounts and those sort of offers. It's an interesting one because the audio or soundscapes on it are specifically engineered with these sound waves that we know are very calming through the aural nerve, through the ear nerve. They really connect to polyvagal nerve regulation. So those are quite interesting ones to explore if you've not explored those. The Calm one also has sound audio which works bilaterally, so you need headphones for them, and the sound is bounced from left to right. And again, this is proven to be really sort of calming. So that's quite an interesting one to explore. Another tool to explore for the body is some of these deep pressure kind of techniques and stretching. Again, the things that we recommend for our children and young people, but do we use them for ourselves? We know the benefits of like deep pressure massage. This might be simple as getting yourself a mini massage gun, using that daily, working out areas of sort of tension, stress. Acupressure is interesting. Doing just a short routine of daily stretches or something like yoga is brilliant. We know there's lots of benefits to yoga. But just thinking about those body-based approaches and what are you doing for your body. There's a few more apps and tools there. So Calm, Headspace. Action for Happiness is a really nice website. It has sort of monthly diaries. You might have seen that one. But that's a really nice one to check out as well. And just as we finish, so we're just coming to the end now of my bit before I hear some of your questions. Just have a little think to yourselves, and again, you can pop this in the chat Q&A box. Setting yourself an intention, even if it's a little tiny intention. It could be reducing coffee from 3 cups a day to 1 cup a day, just doing that for a month and seeing if you notice a difference. It could be setting a bedtime routine just a little bit earlier. Anything that you think, a micro habit, doesn't have to be running a marathon. That's not what we're talking about, but something right now that you think you could commit to, that you could implement over the next month, that feels sustainable and has a benefit to your well-being for the long term. So have a little think about that. I hope some of that's been useful. We've come to the end now, and I'm really, excited to hear your questions and thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Anna, for presenting a great presentation. We've had a few questions submitted. Our first question is, what is the approach to discipline when dealing with learners with special needs?
Ooh, okay, I'm going to jot that one down. Because the approach to discipline. Dealing with learners with SEN. Okay. So discipline is it's a huge topic. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer that in full in the time that we have. But what I would say about behavioural policies within school, again, going back to your specific settings, I'd be really curious about what the behavioural policies look like in your settings for all of your pupils, and then around your pupils with special educational needs. What's the framework that's in place? What is it? Trauma informed? Is it working? Yeah, so is the behavioural policies that you have in place, are they working? Do they suit everybody's needs? Are they differentiated according to need? It's really hard for me to answer that question because I work here in a residential setting with a small school attached. So our children are here with us 24/7, 365 days a year, living in full residential care and with very complex needs, very high levels of need. So the behavioural and inclusion policies that we have here are highly tailored, obviously, to the children's needs that we are working with here. If you're in a mainstream setting, you're going to be working across a very great range of different needs. And I don't think that behavioural policies can be a one size fits all. That makes sense. Particularly when we're talking about special educational needs. So it's a really complex area with discipline, behavioural policy, and I would say look at the underpinning sort of evidence base for what is informing your behavioural policy. Is it trauma informed? Is it based on what we know about trauma and special educational needs, about autism, about neurodiversity? Like, where is the sort of the evidence underpinning your behavioural policy, and then go from there if you feel like it's not working. I hope that's helpful.
That was great, Anna. Thank you. Our next question is, this one's quite a long one. I'm having real difficulty trying to persuade my school to adapt our behaviour policy for our pupils with SEND. All suspensions and exclusions have been pupils with SEN. Is there any documentation I can access to support a change in the policy to give a reasonable adjustment for pupils with SEN? For example, a pupil cannot be excluded if their behaviour is a result of their impairment.
Yeah, so fascinating, absolutely fascinating question about permanent exclusion. What's the place of PECs or permanent exclusion and our children with special educational needs? I would say there is a lot of evidence that you can draw on, and you might need some specific input for that. So you might need the input of your EP for your locality, for your setting. Every school's got access to an EP or to another clinician, someone that can support. But I would really draw in an evidence base around how children and young people with SEN, with neurodiversity, what adjustments they're already making in order to access mainstream education, and then what are the adjustments. This is across the board. Like, what are the broad adjustments that are recommended? There is quite a lot out there. There'll be some resources on the Witherslack site as well, on our website, about this. I think as well, then, on a one-by-one sort of basis, a case-by-case basis, you also need some really robust sort of evidence-based and probably clinically informed sort of like formulation work, really, from your psychologist or a clinical team that is supporting these children. Someone that has contributed to their EHCP, that understands that child's special educational need and their presentation. And you need that working formula basically for that child, and it needs to be quite live and it needs to be quite dynamic. So it is, both things. I think it's the underlying understanding of neurodiversity, and that is tough in the system, in the mainstream system that we have, because of shrinking resource, because of staff time, and how we support, how many people can support with inclusive behavioural policy. Literally, how many bodies of staff do we have in order to make that happen? And then it's their own working practice. You have to do a bit of that informing people's working practice. Do all your pastoral and behavioural team have neurodiversity training for a start? Is the training in place? Do they know what your young people are really experiencing day to day? And then you need that one-to-one sort of profile and formulation, really, which I think is also should be in the EHCP, but if it's not, having a clinician draw that up for you. So there is again quite a lot to that one, I would say. I hope that's helpful.
Oh, that was great, Anna. Thank you. We've got time for one more question. Our last question is, how do you help maintain a child's good behaviour if the parents' parenting styles are different to each other? The child is confused about expected behaviour and making the right choices. Do you have any advice?
Yeah, the advice is that the parents need a little bit of parent work. So if your parents aren't a team and if they're not on the same page, it is really confusing for children, whether children have a special educational need or not. It's confusing and it's emotionally destabilizing as well for the child. So a little bit of guidance for the parents. This can be really difficult in families who are separated. But the strong advice, I think, from you guys as professionals to a parenting team or a team of carers is that they need to do more to come together to be like a parenting team. They are the parenting team for their child. And the best outcomes always come from working as a team. So there may be some intervention work that's possible in your setting. It can be as little as 4 sessions if you have a parent counsellor available to the school. You may not, but if you do have anyone that does that work, I would really offer quite quickly, as little as like 2, 3, 4 sessions, just to have that professional with those parents, steering them and guiding them towards this teamwork approach. They can disagree in private and they can obviously have their disagreements, but helping them to do that separately, and coming to a place where when they're parenting their child, caring for their child, they're forming much more of that parenting team, as we know it's so important to children's well-being. And some of that can be as little, as I say, as little as a few sessions, and helping them with a little bit of like reflective practice. Like they bring an example of a conflict, and then you sit in the room together and you look at what happened for you in that moment, what happened for you in that moment. So if you have access to somebody like a parent worker or a parent counsellor, I would really offer that quite quickly if you can.